Well, good morning, y'all. Well, today is a celebration of the fact that the way that we left it on Good Friday night is not the way that it stayed. It was not game over for those who witnessed the death of Jesus on the cross as they feared. Evil did not win out because it was on this day, the third day, that the stone was rolled away and Jesus stepped out of the grave and conquered death because Christ is risen. There's something about Easter that always causes me to pause and reflect about my own personal beliefs and faith. And it's a mixed bag for me because it's a very religious holiday. And yet, I find myself, the older I get, becoming less and less religious with every passing year. You see, religion is defined as something that is more cultural, that we go through the religious set of practices and rituals and keeping religious beliefs and laws because we're wanting to keep family tradition, or it's the way that we were just raised, or we just want to keep our parents happy by holding to the religious beliefs of our families. I personally was raised to be very religious. I grew up in the church, a pastor's kid no less. I was practically born in the church nursery. I was raised in the Sunday school class. My dad had me preaching by the time I was 13. I went to Bible college right out of high school, was ordained by 20, and had my own church by 21. So looking back at it now, it feels like it was a little over the top. I wasn't just religious, I was like super religious. But here's the problem. When it came down to it, I was living off my family's faith. And my family's faith could not be my faith. In fact, as it turns out, I didn't have any faith at all. I was just being religious. And the problem with religion is that in those dark nights of desperation and despair, in those moments of temptation, religion is not enough to keep us close to God. And so ultimately, I ended up walking away from the church for a whole lot of years, because it had no meaning for me really anymore. It was just empty religion. The irony is that even though I was trained in the study of religion and the Bible, I had no clue what the Christian faith was really all about. I was just like this lost soul wandering around trying to find my way out of the religious fog, so that I could find something real to believe in. I have to say that my view of Jesus today is not this nice, neat religious view that I had of him growing up. After a lot of years of screwing up my life and making a lot of mistakes, and going through hard times and a whole lot of pain, I have learned that there's no easy way to follow Jesus. There's no easy answer as to why I do follow him, but I can tell you this. I love him. And I'm a better person because I do. And when I can finally stop for a New York minute in the craziness of my life long enough to just take a breath and be still and know, I do know. There is nothing better for me in my life than living for Jesus. One of the things I think that brought me back to my faith, I think, was the realization that the Jesus that I was raised to believe in was completely different than the Jesus that I came to know later in life. And believe it or not, I think it's easier to be religious than it is to follow Jesus. Because when it's religion, it's all about kind of doing things that are inside of a box. It's clean, it's neat, it's easy, it's formulaic, right? I can go to church on Sunday, I can pray before meals, I can keep the 10 Commandments, and I can sleep at night because I know my perception of myself is that I'm a good person. But Jesus said it's not about that. In fact, Jesus hit this whole notion kind of right between the eyes in the book of Matthew when he says, "You hypocrites, you negate the word of God for the sake of your tradition. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts, they're far from me. They worship me in vain because their teachings are merely just human rules." So when Jesus comes on the scene, religion had overtaken the world, and now Jesus is single-handedly tearing apart religion as it was known in his day and says, unless you have a heart for God, unless it's more than just the rules and rituals, then you really don't have a faith at all. It's just an empty religion. He says, you want to be a follower of God, then don't just pay lip service where the words that you say on the outside don't match the beliefs that you have on the inside. Jesus said, what this is all about is loving the Lord your God with all your heart and letting that penetrate everything about your life. And if you do, I promise you this, life will get real complicated for you. Because now you really are trying to live your life the way Jesus would live, and it raises the bar on everything. It's way more messier to follow the Jesus who forgives adulterers and hangs out with sinners who are not socially accepted than it is to follow the Jesus whose picture hangs there on the Sunday school room wall, who only wants the right people, the good people in his church. But the truth is that Jesus didn't care anything about that. He broke the rules and he loved everyone the same, no matter where they were from, what color their skin was, or how bad their past was. I mean, you have to remember that this is the same Jesus who, as he was dying, forgives the criminal who's hanging on the cross next to him before he takes his last breath so that he can be with him in paradise and have eternal life. Because when you follow Jesus, it's not about being a good person. We'll never be good enough. It's about accepting his grace and forgiveness. Jesus describes it this way: "Woe to you, hypocrites! You clean the outside of the dish, but inside you are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the dish, and then the outside will also be clean. Woe to you, hypocrites! You're like whitewashed tombs, which look real beautiful on the outside, but on the inside, you're full of dead man's bones and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as being all righteous, but on the inside, you're full of hypocrisy and wickedness." Does that sound like the religious Jesus that so many of us grew up with? Man, it sure sounds to me like we could almost describe him as being anti-religion, doesn't it? Jesus was bound and determined to wrestle religion away from the Pharisees, who were the religious leaders of his day, so that no one could ever stand in the way of us having a direct relationship with Jesus. Unfortunately, there are a lot of religious leaders who even today have tried to wrestle control back away from Jesus. They have this method of trying to dominate people or to shame people in order to build their own ego. And there are many churches and Christians who say, Y'all need to come join us, but if you do, you need to think like us, believe like us, look like us if you want to be part of us. And when you understand that, you can begin to understand the mentality, because when you look at why most Americans in the most recent polls on religion, most people said they were not very religious people. In fact, I think only 23% describe themselves as being very religious in America. And yet, 97% of Americans say they believe in God. Well, how do you reconcile that? I think it's because people are just lost and want to find something that's real, something that's authentic. I think most people don't understand who Jesus really is and what the Christian faith is really all about. Because Jesus didn't much care about keeping up appearances or being seen with the right kind of people or fitting in. In fact, Jesus hung out with people whose lives were messy, people who had all kinds of sin issue going on. And none of them would ever be accepted by the religious leaders of his day. And so here's Jesus who's loving on them, acting like these messed up sinner people somehow matter. Jesus said it's not about how good you look on the outside or how righteous you make people think that you are. It's about what's on the inside that matters. It's about the heart. When Jesus says, come and follow me, he doesn't say, come and follow me and be religious. He's saying, come and give your heart to me. Come and be in relationship with me. Jesus was different. And the people of his time knew it. They couldn't quite put their finger on it, but they knew it. He didn't teach religion. He taught hope and compassion and love. For hundreds of years, the religious leaders taught that following God is for the religious elite. It's all about looking righteous and keeping the do's and don'ts of moralities and hiding your sin. If you screw up, you better make sure that nobody finds out about it. And they worked really hard to keep common folk out. But then Jesus shows up and blows the lid right off of religion and says, following me has nothing to do with religion at all. It's all about your heart. If religion is about doing, then following Jesus is about being. It's who you are at your core. And then all of that naturally flows out of us and shows up in the things that we do and the way that we live. The Jesus I follow, he's full of compassion. And he flies against all of the stuff that I hate about religion. I used my disdain for religion as an excuse for a lot of years as to why I wouldn't give my life for God. And it became an excuse for a lot of time just to be able to live my life in a selfish way that I wanted to live. But when I really sat down and I discovered the truth about Jesus, about who he really was, I knew I wanted to follow him. Because when you follow the real Jesus, you know it when you see it, and you want what's real. While I am at times embarrassed to call myself a Christian because of all the evil and the, quite frankly, stupid stuff that gets done and said in the name of Christianity, I am never embarrassed to call myself a follower of Jesus, because he's the only thing in this world that I have found that is real. For those of you who don't know me, I am actually in my paying job Monday through Friday. I'm a real estate developer. And I just finished a new high-rise project in downtown Houston with a very well-known architect. And just a few blocks away from that project is what I think one of the most beautiful modern-day cathedrals of our time that I've ever seen. It's called Sacred Heart, and it was actually designed by the same architect. So one evening we were catching a drink together, and I asked him just to tell me the story about the development of this cathedral. And he begins to tell me about the construction in great detail. And all along the way, as he tells the story, he kept mentioning that the construction supervisor on the job was not a believer, and he'd kind of become a wet blanket on the whole project. He said this guy, he was always complaining, making sarcastic remarks about religion and the fact that he had to build this church. And he said it really just detracted from the beauty and the spirit of the project. But then he said something happened as they were putting the final touches on the church. He said, you see, the church had ordered this crucifix from an artist in Italy who would handcraft it by wood. And he said when he saw it, he described it as being one of the most beautiful and yet most haunting pieces of art he's ever seen. However, when the crucifix arrived on site and they opened it, they saw those two words that every father hates to read on Christmas Eve night: assembly required. So can you believe that this piece of art, coming all the way from Italy, they had to put it together. They had to assemble Jesus. So as they go to uncrate it, said there were the two pieces of the cross, which were pretty straightforward. But he said the life-sized body of Jesus came in a wooden box that he said eerily looked like a lot like a coffin. And so they put the cross together first, and then they carefully remove the sculpted body of Jesus from the crate. But when they go to attach him to the cross, there was nothing to attach him with. There was no hooks or things that you could do to attach him to the cross. And so they kind of scratched their head for a minute until all of a sudden they realize that in the bottom of the crate, there are 3 spikes, 3 metal spikes. And the intention is that somebody has to drive the spikes into the hands and feet of Jesus in order to attach him to the cross. And they all kind of step away and they do the Mikey's Brothers thing, like, I'm not going to do it, you do it. I'm not going to do it. Well, seeing that nobody's going to do it, this supervisor grabs the stakes in kind of a grist manner, and he's kind of disgusted at the weakness of his workers. He says, I'll do it. So he begins to drive the first spike into the left hand of the sculpture of Jesus. And the architect says, as he does, the visual impact is so overwhelming that everybody just stops. And all you could hear in the entire place was this hammer hammering against this metal stake over and over and over again as he drives the stakes into the hands and feet of Jesus. And he says, as he's finishing, all of a sudden, the supervisor raises the hammer up and he stops. And he said it was almost as if he looks into the eyes of Jesus and he begins to cry. And he said, he wipes the tears away, but this guy is like determined to get the job done, and so he hits the hammer harder against the spike, and as he does, he cries harder and harder until finally he is visibly shaking and crying uncontrollably. And as he drives the last spike into the feet of Jesus, he immediately drops the hammer and walks out. It was sometime later that the architect was able to catch up with the supervisor, and he asked him about that moment. And he said that all he was willing to say was that it was the oddest thing. The supervisor said, as I began to drive those spikes, he said it was like it all came to life for me. It all became so real, and I was overcome with emotion. And then he said, I don't think I'll ever be the same. That vision will stick with me for the rest of my life. You know, I hear that story, and I think to myself, how many times have I been this close to Jesus that I could just reach out and touch him? I mean, I've been rubbing shoulders with Jesus ever since I was a boy in my Sunday school class. And yet I am so capable of reducing Jesus to some mythical figure in my imagination that makes it so it's like not even real. And my life remains unchanged. What will it take for his presence, this risen Jesus, to become real in my life? What will it take for me to wake up and to look down and to see that every time I walk away from him, every time I reject him, every time I push him out of my life, I am the one holding the hammer, driving the spike into his nail-pierced hands and feet? What will it take for me to stop long enough to look him in the eyes and know he's real? Through my some 50 years-ish of living, I've learned a thing or two about walking the narrow dirt path that leads to Jesus. I've learned there's a big difference between faith and religion. I've learned that following Jesus is not an easy road, but it's really easy to lose your way. I've learned that understanding Jesus and trying to live every day for Jesus is really quite messy. It's not formulaic, and it's not easily understood. But I've also learned that when you live it in an authentic way, there is no better life. You see, I've made my choice. And I'm not living to build my life with wealth or power or looking good or righteous. I'm committed to walking the dusty, narrow, dirt path that really is messy at times, knowing that one day, when I get to the end of that journey, it will lead me to a Jesus who is very, very real.